There is an image that gets repeated so often in casual conversation about ancient humans that it has become a kind of reflex. People imagine cave people huddled under a random rock, or small groups sleeping fully exposed under the open sky, living without houses in some permanent state of discomfort and danger. The unspoken assumption is that real housing, solid, protective, comfortable homes, is a modern invention, and that for most of human history, people simply went without. That picture is, like many popular ideas about prehistory, both technically grounded in a grain of truth and almost completely misleading at the same time. And untangling why is one of the more satisfying exercises in rethinking how humans actually live in their environments. Because the question, how did ancient humans live without houses, hides a much more interesting question underneath. What exactly counts as a house? And how did humans solve the basic problems that houses solve long before concrete walls and locking doors existed? The popular image this phrase conjures, a naked, half-frozen hunter-gatherer trying to sleep on the bare ground in the rain, with no roof, no walls, and no plan, is almost completely wrong. The reality is both more creative and more complicated. Ancient humans did, in many places and times, live without what we would call houses in a modern, permanent, suburban sense. But they did not live without shelter, without planning, or without architecture in any meaningful way. So, let us actually take this idea apart and see what is really inside it. The first thing to understand is the difference between a house as we picture it today and shelter as a functional solution to survival problems, because these are two completely different concepts that get casually conflated in ways that produce enormous confusion. A modern house is a very specific package: permanent foundation, rigid walls, a roof, clear boundaries of ownership, often linked to a single patch of land for many years or decades. It is not just a structure. It is also a legal object, an economic asset, a piece of infrastructure. When people say ancient humans had no houses, they are usually comparing that modern package to earlier forms of life and finding them lacking. Shelter, on the other hand, is much more basic and much more flexible. It is any arrangement of materials, space, and behavior that solves a cluster of survival problems: keeping heat in or out, keeping water off your body, reducing wind, avoiding predators, getting sleep, and managing smoke from fire. Once you define the problem that way, it becomes immediately obvious that humans have been building shelter systems for a very long time, even in the absence of what we would recognize as permanent houses. Here is a simple thought experiment that illustrates exactly why this distinction matters. Imagine two groups of people. Group A lives in permanent wooden houses with stone foundations. They stay in one valley for generations. The houses are solid, but because they are locked into one place, if the river floods badly or the local game disappears, they are stuck. Their walls are strong, but their strategy is rigid. Group B has no permanent houses at all. Instead, they move seasonally across a large territory. In different seasons, they use very different shelter solutions: caves and rock overhangs in winter, lightweight portable tents or brush shelters in summer, and sometimes simply sleep under the stars on dry, warm nights. Their architecture is ephemeral and mobile, but their survival strategy is highly flexible. At no point are they actually exposed to the elements in the way our mental cartoon suggests. They just solve the shelter problem differently. If you ask, which group has houses? The answer depends entirely on what you think a house is. If a house must be permanent, owned, and immovable, then Group B has none. But if a house is any human-designed arrangement of space that protects you and organizes your life, then Group B is absolutely surrounded by architecture. It's just temporary, seasonal, and woven into the landscape itself. This, in simplified form, is almost exactly what is happening when we talk about ancient humans living without houses. The apparent lack of houses in the archaeological record is driven overwhelmingly by the kind of structures that were used, often portable, made of wood, hides, brush, and earth, not by some romantic idea that people simply tolerated the cold rain pouring on their faces every night. The more revealing and more accurate way to frame the question is not, why did they have no houses, but what kinds of shelters did they build, how permanent were they, and why? When archaeologists and anthropologists look closely at ancient and contemporary hunter-gatherer populations, the picture changes dramatically. Groups that did not build permanent stone or fired brick houses still routinely used caves, rock shelters, wattle and daub huts, animal skin tents, snow shelters, and earth lodges. They modified landscapes with windbreaks, fire rings, sleeping platforms, and organized camp layouts. The architectural footprint is there. It is just often made of materials that decay and disappear, or it is baked directly into the environment in ways that do not look like a house in a modern real estate listing. So the real question becomes, how did these humans, without permanent houses, actually make daily life work? To understand that, we have to look at the specific problems they were solving and the tools they had to solve them. The first major category is climate and seasonality. Temperature, rain, wind, and snow shape everything about shelter. A small, mobile group living in a warm, dry environment can get away with far more open, minimal shelter than a group in a cold, wet one. In some parts of the world, for much of the year, sleeping under a simple windbreak with a fire is not only tolerable, but comfortable. In other places, going one night without serious protection in winter is a death sentence. Hunter-gatherer populations living in highly seasonal climates often responded not by building one massive permanent house, but by moving between different types of shelters as the seasons changed. A winter base might be a cave system or a cluster of semi-subterranean huts dug partly into the ground to conserve heat. A summer camp might be a set of light frameworks of poles covered with hides, bark, or brush, built to allow airflow while still providing shade. In both cases, the essential needs, warmth, dryness, safety, social space, are being met. The solution is just mobile. The second category is mobility and resources. Before agriculture, many human groups depended on widely scattered, seasonally available food sources. Herds of animals migrate. Plants ripen in one region and then another. Rivers flood and recede. If your food moves, you move, unless you have a way to store enormous amounts of surplus, which most early foragers did not. Permanent, heavy houses lock you into one spot. Lightweight, quickly built shelters allow you to follow the food. In this context, not having a house in the modern sense is not a failure. It is a trade-off. You sacrifice solid walls in one location to gain flexibility across many locations. You invest your effort not into one heavy structure, but into skills. How to choose a good campsite, how to orient your shelter against wind and rain, how to quickly weave branches into a roof, how to raise and collapse a hide tent in hours. The third category is materials and durability. Archaeology is biased towards stone, bone, and ceramics, things that survive for thousands of years. Wood, leather, grass, and brush often vanish without a trace. A stone house leaves obvious remains. A carefully built wooden lodge with a thatched roof, occupied for years, can disappear almost completely if it burns, collapses, and rots. This matters because it means the sentence, "ancient humans had no houses," often actually means we see fewer durable remains of permanent architectural structures built with stone or brick in certain times and places. That is not the same thing as saying people slept unprotected. It is the difference between what was built and what survived long enough for us to find it. There is another dimension to this that deserves emphasis. Clothing, fire, and social organization themselves functioned as mobile shelter technologies. Clothing, especially layered, insulated garments, turns your own body into a kind of moving house. A fur cloak, a woven hood, insulated footwear, and a good fire can make a minimal physical shelter workable in climates where naked humans would die quickly. Fire, controlled and maintained carefully, creates a bubble of habitable microclimate around a camp. It dries wet clothing, wards off some predators, and makes otherwise inedible foods safe. Social organization matters too. Small bands, sharing watch duties, arranging sleep so that vulnerable members, children, the injured, the elderly, sleep at the most protected interior spots, and placing hearths and sleeping circles strategically collectively create a household, even when the walls are made of nothing more than hides and branches. To see how all of these pieces fit together, it is worth looking more closely at the variety of shelter strategies ancient humans actually used, because the diversity is itself an answer to the question. In some regions, caves and rock overhangs functioned as natural houses, pre-built by geology. Humans modified these spaces with hearths, sleeping areas, storage niches, and sometimes simple walls or windbreaks at the entrance. In cold seasons, a deep cave with a narrow mouth could trap heat surprisingly well. Smoke from fires could vent upward through cracks or be managed by positioning of hearths. These were not houseless lives. They were lives rooted in stone architecture that humans did not have to build from scratch. In other regions without suitable caves, humans built semi-permanent huts. A common pattern was to dig shallow pits, drive wooden posts into the ground around the edges, and create a domed or pitched roof of branches covered with hides, bark, turf, or thatch. Some of these structures were used year after year as seasonal camps, with repairs and rebuilding as needed. From the outside, they might look like simple mounds or brush piles. From the inside, they were warm, organized, and clearly home for the people who lived there. In still other contexts, especially among highly mobile groups following large game, tents and temporary shelters dominated. Frameworks of flexible poles could be raised quickly, covered with animal skins or woven mats, and taken down just as fast. Snow shelters, such as domed constructions made from blocks of compacted snow, allowed life in extreme polar environments where no permanent wooden or stone housing was feasible without tremendous cost. What all of these have in common is not the absence of houses, but the presence of architecture tuned to mobility, material, and risk. There is also a methodological point here that quiets another common assumption. Simply counting permanent houses in the archaeological record and drawing big conclusions about the lifestyle of entire species is dangerous. The techniques used to identify ancient dwellings, from faint post holes, soil discolorations, scattered hearthstones, and a few bits of daub, are complex and often uncertain. For decades, many subtle dwellings were simply invisible in the dataset because our methods were not sensitive enough to see them. As techniques have improved, reanalysis of old sites has often revealed far more evidence of structured living spaces, repeated camp use, and intentional layout than earlier work suggested. It is worth pausing here to think about how all of this compares with the shift to agriculture and truly permanent villages, because that is often where the idea of real houses enters the story. When humans began to farm crops and domesticate animals, the logic of mobility changed. Fields require staying in one place through the growing season. Stored grain invites theft, which encourages walls and boundaries. Suddenly, investing labor into durable, heavy structures begins to make sense because you are tying your survival not to your ability to move, but to your ability to protect and work a specific piece of land. Houses in the strong, modern sense, thick walls, fixed foundations, long-term occupancy, proliferated in this context. But the transition was not a straightforward improvement in every dimension. Early farmers often worked longer, harder hours than foragers, lived in closer proximity to waste and disease, and were more vulnerable to crop failures. The solid house was part of a new solution set, but also part of a new set of problems. If we go back to the original question, how did ancient humans live without houses? There is one more psychological layer worth examining. The persistent popularity of this idea serves a kind of narrative function in our own minds. The image of fragile, helpless, houseless ancients flatters our present by contrast. It suggests that modern life, with its concrete walls and temperature-controlled rooms, represents a simple, linear story of progress from total exposure to total comfort. The more accurate picture is more interesting and, in its own way, more humbling. The achievement of modern housing is not that we suddenly invented the idea of shelter, or that before brick and concrete, humans simply suffered in the open. Ancient humans were extraordinarily skilled at reading landscapes, choosing sites, and building just enough structure to solve the problems they actually faced. They combined clothing, fire, social organization, natural formations, and lightweight architecture into flexible shelter systems that could be raised, abandoned, and rebuilt as needed. What has changed most dramatically is not the existence of houses, but their form and function. We have concentrated shelter into heavy, permanent boxes anchored to specific plots of land, tightly integrated with infrastructure, electricity, water, sewage, roads. We have reduced the daily cognitive load of thinking about where and how to sleep safely. But we have also traded a great deal of mobility and environmental flexibility for that stability. Ancient humans did live without houses in the narrow, modern sense. No concrete slabs, no apartment blocks, no property deeds. They did not, however, live without shelter, without planning, or without architecture. The actual story underneath the phrase "without houses" is both more precarious in its reliance on skill, weather, and group cooperation, and more impressive in its demonstration of how far human ingenuity can go with wood, skin, stone, and fire. The flat image of a houseless past captures something real about the absence of permanent built environments as we know them. It simply does not capture what most people assume it captures: an endless, miserable exposure to the elements. The actual story is that for most of our history, we carried our housing knowledge in our hands and in our heads rather than in fixed walls, a species that learned, gradually and with extraordinary creativity, to turn almost any landscape into a temporary home.